I've developed this website and written a book with the same title, Why Biblical Creation is True. A bit about myself first, so you can get like a little bit of understanding how I came to do this. I have a strong interest in science, and I've been that way my entire life. I don't know why that is the case, but that is the case. Uh, and my college training involved degrees in physics, mathematics, and engineering. And as a result of all of that science in my studies, I ended up working for the research division of a major oil company for over 30 years. And so it's been kind of all science all the time in terms of my real interest in the world. Uh, the area of science, the thing that it really drives me is something that Socrates said a long time ago, and that is to follow the data wherever it may lead, meaning that don't go into a science area to try to solve a problem with a preconceived answer that you're looking for, but instead take the data and let it lead you wherever it may be. That leads me to the fact of what this website and book are all about the early parts of the Bible history. And the question is, are they real? Are the early parts of the Bible real? Now, the Bible is definitely just history in that part. The only thing they're reporting what happened, not telling us how. No scientific detail is included. And therefore, in order to do what I want to do in this website and in this book, is I must apply straight proven science to these facts and not try to get a preconceived result. Well, these are the 6 areas that I'll be talking about where we have scientific support from these 6 things that were mentioned in the early part of the Bible. Starting out, first topic here is 6 days of creation. I'll show you that literally from the best science we have today is that there were 6 intervals of creation. Not 6 days on the 24-hour clock we live on, but 6 intervals on a different clock that I'll show you. That what comes into that area there is something called the Big Bang, and it may, at this point, cause you to smile and think that that's not possible, but I'll show you where that is the explanation, and it's now the Big Bang law that describes these 6 days of creation. The second one here is the planet Earth is good, and I included this because certainly when God made the Earth, at least in the book of Genesis, when he made the Earth, he said that the Earth is good, as he did for all of his other good creation activities. And I include this because today there is discussion that there is a problem with the Earth. It was called global warming, and now it's called climate change, and even predictions that within 12 years the Earth will be uninhabitable. So I included that to show you not only is the Earth good, but it will continue to be, and that climate change is not a threat. The third area here is finding Adam and Eve. Can we find Adam and Eve? And this is DNA cell biologists who have technology to be able to look for the first ancestor of a given species, like the human species. And so they can do tests on human species living on Earth today and point back toward the first of their type. They did it here for Eve, and they found that this first female human species lived on Earth about 200,000 years ago. It was not the answer they wanted, but that's the answer they got. I'll explain that further. After that, they did another test, and these same DNA cell biologists to look for the first male. And when they did these tests for the first male, they unfortunately got a number that was not the same as females and caused a little confusion initially. But I'll show you what they found, and there's a good explanation for that. What they found was Noah of the Bible. After the flood, Noah is the first male that we men on Earth today point to with our DNA. The fifth one here is about 1,000-year lifetimes. This is a similar sort of thing to 6 days of creation that may be kind of hard for you to just accept, but I'm going to show you that with DNA advances that have occurred here involving the Nobel Prize, actually, shows that 1,000-year lifetimes are possible, that there's a way to live a lot longer if we only had a certain gene turned on in our body that, again, resulted in the Nobel Prize given to the people that studied this area. And finally, a little brief discussion about the human races. Are we all one type of human being, or we have different skin colors and different aspects to our being, or are we all one the same human being? And in fact, why are we different? And we'll see that vitamin D is a good explanation, at least for the color of skin in which way we differ. And I'll explain that to you as an explanation for how the races evolved. Here is the story of the 6 days of creation, and I'm going to explain to you what the Big Bang is and show you that ultimately it is the Big Bang law of physics. Now, when I said Big Bang, I would expect that most of you recoiled and said, that is a ridiculous idea, couldn't possibly happen. Well, I'm going to show you that indeed it is the explanation that physicists have for, and cosmologists have for, the existence of the universe as we see today. Briefly, what the Big Bang theory was starting out is that all energy in the universe was initially confined to a very small region. That region then blew apart and enlarged into today's universe that we see. Now, two of the consequences, if that is true, then there should be some energy left over after this Big Bang happened and converted whatever mass it could into mass, and then the remaining energy must still be present, and we ought to be able to find it. So that's the Big Bang law. Now, what happens with proposed theories, when you have a theory, it becomes a science when the predictions that it makes are verified. In the case of the Big Bang theory, two predictions were made. The remnant energy not converted into mass should be detectable here on Earth. So this big ball of energy blew up. When it cooled, it stopped making mass anymore, converting energy into mass, and then that radiation was dragged along with the universe that has exploded. We should be able to see it, and it should not be coming from the same direction. Those are the two predictions that were made. Well, those two predictions were verified. The remnant radiation was discovered in 1959 and resulted in the Nobel Prize for those who discovered this remnant radiation from the Big Bang. And then NASA sent up the COBE satellite to measure the radiation coming from different directions, and they did find that it was coming from different directions. On Earth, it appeared to be all coming from the same direction. The result of that is the Big Bang theory is now the Big Bang law that explains how the universe was created. Now, another aspect of this that comes into play that's going to be very hard for you to understand, hopefully you understand a little bit about the Big Bang now, but this remnant radiation that was discovered in effect is a clock. And in effect, it is the clock of the universe. This figure down here is a bit difficult to follow and understand, but it is the clock of the universe that has been ticking or progressing for 6 intervals of time. And I've shown it here as if it were a clock standing on a desk or something, but it's really a strangest clock you've ever seen. Here is day 1, in which the clock went that distance, like almost halfway of this interval. And then day 2 was shorter, and day 3 and day 4 and day 5 and day 6 were similarly shorter. But these days are so strange, and they are 6 cosmic clock days, and they equal 15 billion Earth years. It's probably going to take you getting into the actual book itself and or some of the appendices in order to understand this, but this is the clock of the universe. And the strangest thing about this clock is that the length of a cosmic day, hour, minute, second is not
constant. It's slowly, ever so slowly, speeding up. That this day was of 24 hours that are not the same as the 24 hours here is speeding up. But that's going to be a little bit hard for you to comprehend, but it is the physics of the situation and the physics of the Big Bang law. Now, here is a brief look at a check of that idea. And it just shows you day 5 that was predicted to be this long, and day 6 this long, and then looking at the oldest fossils that have been found. And here are the oldest fossils that have been found of water creatures. Lo and behold, they occurred on day 5, as the Bible says, and here's the first fish that appeared as a fossilized creature. And similarly, the first sea monsters and the first bird were all on day 5. On day 6, the oldest mammal found in the fossil record is here, and of course we have man. The same is true for days 3 and 4, in which there were just plants. But basically, this is a verification that plants, sea life, birds, mammals, and mankind appear at the correct cosmic day.
Let's look at the second area here now of the so-called planet is good. And since the 1980s or so, there's been predictions that the Earth has been increasing in this temperature such that global warming was going to cause a significant problem, make the Earth uninhabitable. And then that later transisted into climate change as the reason for this happening. Now, here is a plot of the measured average Earth annual temperatures from 1850 up to the present time. And you can see that in general, the yin-yang back and forth here, but it's going up, generally basically going an upward trend. There are a couple different things of interest here. In the late 40s, for the span of 30 or 40 years here, the temperature, instead of being increased, the temperature seemed to be leveling off. And this was when there were predictions of an impending ice age coming upon us, that it was going to be real bad or get very cold. And that led to the first Earth Day, which was April 22nd of 1970. And then after that, the temperature did continue to increase. And at this point in here, it had a level off for a while, and that was termed in the literature as the hiatus. And since it leveled off there and the Earth did not continue to warm as it had been expected to warm, the mantra of global warming was dropped and it was changed to climate change because the Earth did not warm with time. Well, here is the ways that have been proposed so far to model what is going on with this temperature increase. And there you may have heard the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change here is UNIPCC. And since the early 80s, they have been working on a model, a very quite complicated and difficult to calculate model to fit that Earth temperature versus time. And here is that black data on this plot are the same data that you just saw for temperatures versus time. And here is the red figure, which is the model by the UNIPCC scientists. And there are several areas here where there's a problem here. The model overpredicted the temperature in this time span from the 1900 to 1930. And then it overpredicted here again. And here it really overpredicted in the 2000 and beyond. And this is when global warming was dropped as a phrase for what's going on with that temperature. Instead, it was changed to climate change because global warming did not happen. So it turns out, however, that this model from a mathematical modeling standpoint is quite poor at this point. The fact that it doesn't fit here, here, and here means that there needs to be made improvements on this, and therefore you cannot believe its prediction into the future, which is pretty dire here.
But yet there is a different model that fits these data quite a bit better, and it's known as the cyclical model. And it's based upon the fact that when scientists of various areas went out and got ice cores, they drilled nearshore sediments, coral reefs, and all of these other areas here, when they did studies of that, and they found indirect measurements of what the temperature seemed to have been doing, they found that the climate cycles about every 1,500 years in terms of increased temperature and lower temperature, and increased temperature and lower temperature with endless cycles. And this figure over here is a representation of that cyclical behavior. This green figure here is a simple sine wave that shows the ups and downs of temperature over time. Here is the same black data on the prior figure, and you can see that it at least follows the trend. It isn't expected to agree totally with all details on that at this point, but it shows the trend. And it shows that the Earth will increase in temperature up to about the year 2240, after which it will decline and again reach into a cool zone. What's extremely significant here is if you go back in history and look at the past climate epochs where there's not a measured Earth temperature, but in which there are reports of extreme cold and extreme warm, all of these last 5 cycles that are reported in history fit it very well. For example, the Little Ice Age from 1300 to 1850 led to very cold temperatures on Earth, with little factoids like the fact that the Thames River in London froze over quite a number of times, and such that people were able to walk across and hold what's called frost fairs with coffee houses, etc., on those frost fairs on that solid ice, and it hasn't happened in the last 200 years. Similarly for medieval warming and these other ice ages, you may need to stop this video and study this a bit more, or get the book to see what was going on with this business. Let's take a look at the way that we can compare these two models versus time, at least into the future. We can do this test here. Here is this red line is what the UN IPCC model predicts for the future, and the green line is what the cyclical model predicts for the near future. And what data I've shown on here, the data in black are the same data up through 2014 that were used for the UN IPCC model and for the cyclical model fit. And then here is the data subsequent to that. As we get additional years worth of data from 2020 and beyond, we will then have an idea of which one of these models is agreeing more closely with the actual Earth temperature measurements. I have a feeling it's going to be the cyclical model, but we will see with time what happens. So let's move on here into the third area, and that is finding Adam and Eve. How do you find the first human beings that existed on Earth? Well, it turns out DNA technology has an answer for that. And here is what was done to look for the first female that is the first female ancestor of all the females that are living on Earth today. And it turns out that part of the female DNA, something called mitochondrial DNA, changes very slowly. This is known by the DNA cell biologists as a result of looking at some closed societies where they know that therefore this female mitochondrial DNA changes very slowly. In effect, it becomes a clock. And about 1 every 200 generations, there is a mutation or a change in that DNA, and that change is passed on to that particular female's future generations, and then all these various changes occur and accumulated. So all we need to do is take samples from around the world geographically, from the different continents, different races, and only need about 400 samples. This was initially done on placentas that for various babies that were born, to measure the female mitochondrial DNA. Now, the analysis is relatively easy and inexpensive, and that's why trying to find the first female was done first. The first female tests were conducted, and they were trying to prove that we came that the first female came from a chimpanzee that transisted from a chimpanzee over a long interval of time into the first female human. And they were expecting to find an answer about 5 million years ago. Instead, the first 5 tests showed that the first female lived about only 200,000 years ago. I contend that that is Eve of the Bible, and I'll show you some additional information in the book that says that that is quite likely Eve. Now it's Eve, but not Adam. And it turns out that we can't find Adam by these tests, and you'll see that in the next area. So here is finding Noah, I called it. It was actually done to find Adam by the same cell biologist looking at the DNA of men on Earth. Equivalently for men, it turns out that the male Y chromosome, the chromosome that defines what a male is, changes very slowly also, and it's about once every 250 generations that this Y chromosome has an alteration or a change. So the same story applies here. Take about 400 samples of male Y chromosomes. The problem is that the analysis is difficult and expensive. It's more complicated to do and costs more, and that's why at least it was done second. That's why the female work was done first, because it was easier to do. Well, here is the result, looking for the first male ancestor. And again, it was conducted in order to find this 5 million year number where we men came from a male chimpanzee. Unfortunately here, the first 4 tests found only 78,000 years ago that this first male existed. It was a little bit perplexing. Not only was it not 5 million years, but also it was not the same as the first female. How could that be? Well, the explanation for that is that this is, I believe, Noah. If you believe the Bible about what happened at the time of Noah, God sent a great flood that killed all other men other than Noah and his 3 sons. So they basically had in a sense, a new first male Y chromosome. And that male changes that occurred in the Y chromosome from the time of Adam until Noah disappeared when all the rest of these men perished. So that's why we basically found Noah. Now you might question at this point, well, what about the female? How come you found the female? Well, the book of Bible does not say that Noah and his 3 sons married sisters or all close relatives, and therefore the DNA signal from Eve is present in females today. So basically, this test found Noah of the Bible instead of the first male, which we presume was present with Eve, Adam.
Let's look at 1,000-year lifetimes here. The Bible reports that numerous men lived to be nearly 1,000 years old. I think Methuselah and Noah were 2 of the oldest, approaching 1,000 years, as well as a number of others were close. And I think the youngest reported in that particular part of the Bible died after about 365 years. So extremely long lives are reported there. And the question is, how is this possible? Well, what we know today is that new body cells are often made during a person's lifetime. Your stomach cells wear out and need to be replaced about every 3 days. So what we put it through by eating various things, make it working that hard. And on the opposite extreme, our bones need to have new cells about every 25 years. And all the other body parts are in between 3 days and 25 years in terms of the time interval during which they need to be replaced. When we make a new cell, the complication is that we need to make a copy of the DNA that was in the old cell. So we make a copy of the DNA from the old cell. The original DNA stays in the dying cell, and then the copy goes into the new cell. And the problem is that this copying process can lead to incorrect copies, which can lead to illnesses and even death. to the extent that these copies in a very old person are very incorrect. It can cause organs to fail and this manner of thing. So the copying process has some possibility of getting incorrect copies a lot of times. Now, if a way could be found to prevent bad copies from being made, then lifetimes could be much longer, perhaps as long as 1,000 years.
Now, I need to know a little bit about human DNA. You have your DNA in every single cell, a copy of your DNA in every single cell, and it's broken into 46 parts. And these parts we call chromosomes. And here's a very simplified look at one chromosome that is the part of your DNA. The black areas here are what we call genes, and those are the most important parts of your chromosomes, most important parts of your overall DNA, and there are about 50,000 of those that determine your hair color and your nose shape and all other characteristics that you as an individual have. But each one of those chromosomes has tail ends here that are not seemingly important, just like the area between genes is not real important. It's the genes that are important, but the tail ends here are not important. And for the longest time, this was referred to as junk DNA in the early days when the human genome or the human DNA was mapped out. So it was called junk DNA. Well, in recent times, it's been found, no, that's not junk DNA. That's very important DNA. And in fact, this is another one of those Nobel Prizes that was awarded to discovery and given the name of telomeres. So these are called telomeres. And these telomeres are very important in terms of your physical well-being and your lifespan. The longer these are, as they stay longer, you will live longer. And we'll see in a minute just how this works.
Well, after discovering that these telomeres, the length, was very important for health and length of life, they made another, what I consider a startling discovery. And the startling discovery is they found that within all of our cells at birth, there is a chemical, and they call it an enzyme, and they gave it the name telomerase. So this telomerase enzyme is in all of your cells at birth, but it's only there, unfortunately, in a finite amount. The job of this telomerase is to ensure that these telomeres, the ends of your chromosomes, don't get too short. When they start to shorten, the telomerase comes to lengthen them and maintain their length so that you don't have difficulty copying the DNA the next time the cell is replicated. So they found this telomerase, but then the most startling thing beyond that is they found the gene in the human DNA that makes the telomerase. And so let's say right here is the gene in one of your chromosomes whose has the ability to make more telomerase. If it made more telomerase, your cells would be able to replicate more often and you would have a much longer life. And what they also found was, unfortunately, that this gene is turned off. This gene is not operating. I've shown it here as a wall switch in the off position, saying that gene is not doing what it could do if it were on. And this overall discovery of telomerase, telomerase, and the telomerase making gene ended up with the 2009 Nobel Prize for Medicine. And what it means for me biblically is if that gene were turned on, that life of 1,000 years was certainly possible. For sure, longer lives were possible than the current lifespan we have at about 120 years. Let's talk about the origin of the human races. This is one area in which biblical scholars and evolutionists agree. There is only one species of human being. The Bible scholars believe that because the Bible only talks about creating Adam, doesn't talk about creating other human beings at later times of slightly different type. Similarly, evolutionists cannot agree that the evolution process, this slow, random process of going, let's just say, from a chimpanzee to a human being, could not have resulted in 5 different, slightly different types of human beings all emerging at the same time. So they both agree there's only one species of human beings. Now, it turns out from a scientific standpoint, or maybe a medical standpoint, that human beings need to have the correct amount of vitamin D within their bodies. And correct in the sense that if they have too little or too much, they will be ill, sick, and their bodies will not work as well as they could. So you need to have the right amount of vitamin D in your body. Now, vitamin D that's produced in your body is produced by ultraviolet sun ray light that arrives at the skin cells about 3 layers below the surface of your skin. So the first 3 layers of your skin allow this light to pass through them, and then when it gets to layers 4 and 5, that is where the vitamin D is manufactured. And as a result of that, the 3 surface layers are very important in terms of controlling how much of the light arrives at those particular layers 4 and 5 where the vitamin D is generated. And the amount of pigment that's in those upper 3 layers can have an effect on how much sunlight penetrates. Now, it turns out that light intensity and skin color need to be just right to make the just right amount of vitamin D. And light intensity depends upon where you live on Earth. I know we'll see a little more detail on that in a second. It turns out that there are very few foods on Earth that provide natural vitamin D. There are a few, but there are very few and they're not commonly available to most of humanity. And fortunately for us, in our current lives, we have vitamin D available either in milk or in pill form. So we're never hurting anymore for vitamin D, whereas people in the past, in some cases, would have been. So let's take a look at just how this vitamin D and where it is made after sunlight penetrates our skin. Here's some sunlight coming in. And here are the 1, 2, 3 upper layers of your skin, given these names over here. So those 3 layers, the sunlight must pass through first to get down to these lower 2 layers where the vitamin D is made. And it turns out that the pigment that's in these upper 3 layers, predominantly on the surface of this first layer, the pigment that's in there is going to restrict or control, more correctly, the amount of sunlight that ends up penetrating down to the useful layers here where the vitamin D is actually manufactured. And that's an important concept. Well, let's take a look at this effect of sunlight versus the place on Earth in which you live. Here's a plot of the average daily sunlight that a person receives over a year in these various locations. If you lived at the North Pole, you'd get about this much sunlight on the average per day. If you live on the equator near Nairobi, Kenya, you get on the average this much sunlight per day. Roughly 3 times as much sunlight is arriving at Nairobi, Kenya versus the North Pole. Now, if you had dark skin and you were living at the North Pole, chances are you would not have enough sunlight there to keep the vitamin D in your body well enough. So you better well, if you're living there now, take vitamin D pills or drink milk so that you do have enough vitamin D. In the opposite extreme, if you're very light skinned and you live in Kenya, you get too much production. And so what happens when you live in a place with very light skin where you get a lot of hang? Well, remember what happens to your body is you end up with some pretty good tans. Your body has a mechanism whereby It can change in effect, the color of your skin to become tan so that you get less penetration of that sunlight into your body, and that's a helpful thing. The idea is that, in terms of the biblical sense, that during the time of what is known as the Great Dispersion, the biblical dispersion, where God decided to move humanity out of the Jerusalem and Middle Eastern area where all of humanity existed, he decided to move them out of there, move them to other parts of the earth. He confounded their languages, the Bible says, and so they couldn't communicate with each other and they lived in different places. Well, those who went to the southern part of the earth, into the equator area, they had the ability to develop not only tan skins, but permanently darker skins. Those who went to other areas where there was less sunlight developed lighter skins so that their bodies could again receive the correct amount of vitamin D in their bodies depending upon where you live. This is an explanation for how the races formed as a result of biblical dispersion and being placed on different locations on Earth. Let's wrap this up here with some comments about what you could do if you want to learn more. First of all, there's more detail in these pull-down menus above on this home page where you can look at, I believe it's 6 different videos where you can get a little more detail if you didn't quite understand the brief information I gave you in this overall video. You can get more detail on what's going on in terms of the science behind these 6 areas that I've discussed. If you want even more detail, you could get the book and read the chapters. The chapters, again, contain more information. They give references, and so you can really delve further if you want to really understand these things. If you are really interested in detail, an extreme sort of a sense, kind of like myself, you could read the appendices in the book. They contain lots more detail and understanding of what went on in these various areas. The one thing I would recommend it to you, if you do get the book, all of you, whether you're a science aficionado or not, read Appendix A. Appendix A will enable you to gain an understanding of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which is now the law of relativity. It was used in those cosmic clock Big Bang clock calculations for those 6 time intervals. You'll understand that Albert Einstein's theory, which was relatively simple to derive, demonstrates that the passage of time is not everywhere in the universe the same as it is here on Earth, with our clocks just giving out the same constant flow of time every day. So anyway, read that if you're interested. Beyond that, enjoy the mysteries of science that surround you as you are exposed to further developments in the world of science that I know they will amaze me, and I hope they at least interest you.